Joining us now on the line from Providence, Rhode Island, Nicholas Gvosdev. He is Professor of National Security Studies at the U.S. Naval War College and Senior Editor of the National Interest. Nicholas, good to have you on TVO again tonight. How are you?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Just great, thanks. You wrote a piece for the National Interest in April in which you called for, quote, more proactive measures in battling pirates off the coast of Somalia. So let's get into that. What have you got in mind?
It'll have to be a several-pronged approach. We need more patrols. We need to be building more capacity on land in Somalia to be taking away the attractiveness of piracy. And we frankly need the shipping companies to be able to do more in a cooperative fashion rather than still seeing this as a every company for itself problem.
How important do you think it is to raise the cost of piracy to these pirates?
It has to be both to raise the cost to the pirates in terms of actually having some serious sanctions against piracy. What you essentially have right now is pirates say, I might get shot, but that really doesn't happen. I might get captured, but chances are I'll simply be released back to Somalia, since most countries don't want to claim jurisdiction. So there's no deterrent effect. On the other side, we haven't done much to offer other material incentives, such as helping to rejuvenate the fishing industry, which got the whole piracy problem started in the first place, or simply being able to do some of the tactics that were adopted in Iraq, which is to get people to switch from being pirates to being Coast Guard auxiliaries. As long as they're getting paid a wage and getting a decent living out of it, piracy or doing something else, they'll choose something else if the alternative is just as lucrative.
Well, let me pick up on that last point. And here's a quote actually from your article, Privateering the Pirates. Another solution, you say, is to examine whether the Sons of Iraq model might be applicable to Somalia. Piracy flourishes because it is successful in bringing in income. Pirates perform a Somali version of trickle-down economics because ransoms that are paid for hijacked ships provide an income stream, not only in terms of donations to clans and religious leaders, but also supporting the entire infrastructure for piracy, down to paying the families of those who guard, feed, and house captured sailors. If clans, however, could be paid in cash and services for serving as, quote, Coast Guard auxiliaries, with a clear understanding that payments would continue only if there was a corresponding drop in the number of pirate attacks, this might help to undermine the economic rationale for piracy. Now, what I want to know is, why do you think that solution wouldn't create strife between the pirates and those who choose to act as these so-called Coast Guard auxiliaries?
It could create strife in the short term, but again, if we look at what got these movements started in the first place, people in the early 1990s didn't go out and say, I want to be a pirate. They were either unemployed fishermen or they were unemployed militias still fighting in the aftermath of the collapse of the Siad Barre government in 1991. Piracy was a way to marry fishing and militia skills together. So again, I think that if there are incentive structures in place, it should be possible to bring at least some of these pirates over. Those that have developed sort of a hardcore pirate lifestyle, that may produce some strife in the short term. But again, if we're willing to work with some of the indigenous structures that are in place in Somalia, particularly with these new regional governments that have developed in Somaliland and Puntland, we might then have a chance of isolating the hardcore criminal element out from those for whom piracy is really opportunity rather than a chosen lifestyle.
I wonder, though, whether the fact that for every pirate that we see and know, there are presumably thousands of people in the background who see these people as heroes. And how can you be sure that trying to recruit Somalis to be a kind of Coast Guard on our side, if you like, would have any success at all?
Again, it would depend on the incentive structure. Are we paying something equivalent to what people in the villages are getting right now from the pirate leaders to be either the strike and point people on the ships or to be the guards in the villages? I think that if you have an equalized incentive structure, that can go at least some of the ways to attract people. Not everyone, of course, not every clan in Somalia is benefiting right now from piracy, so there are already some dispossessed and poorer people that I think would look at this as an opportunity to perhaps perform these functions. And again, if we look back at the history of Somalia, you really didn't have piracy as an issue prior to 1991, when there were more established government structures and when, in fact, there was money making its way into the villages because people had livelihoods. The Somali diaspora throughout the Middle East does send money back. That is also an important source of income. But you can really see a connection between no economic opportunities in the coastal villages, and the rise of piracy, combined with, as you had mentioned in your earlier question, the lack of the negative incentives, which are we could be caught, killed, or imprisoned for engaging in these activities.
Well, that leads to our I guess what you're calling the Sons of Iraq model, where, of course, the United States military in Iraq paid some Sunni Iraqis to stop shooting at them, and that appears to have worked in addition to the surge and many other things. The question is, I mean, Iraq had really got to a point where that was almost a last straw attempt, and it seems to have worked. Do you think the situation in Somalia is analogous for it to work there?
It's not completely analogous, and it's correct to point out that they're two different cases altogether. But where you see the similarities are, in fact, if you again look at some of the interviews that have been done with pirates, with some of the people who've been captured, with people in the villages, they stress over and over again the economic rationale for why they're engaging in these activities. Even though you have Islamist movements in Somalia, you have not seen, for example, jihad as a motivating reason for why people have gone out to seize vessels. You don't have a political ideology behind it that says this is a way for us to make a statement to the rest of the world. It does appear to be driven largely by economic considerations. Then, if you factor in, even say from the shipping company's side, the money that they're having to set aside in their contingency funds if ships get captured, higher insurance premiums, the cost perhaps of private security if they decide to go that route for their own ships. And you think about, do you want to pay a firm in London to have to deploy armed guards on your vessels, or do you want to contribute perhaps to a Coast Guard auxiliary fund for Somalia? And it does look like it's a more cost-effective measure for the shipping companies. And then, of course, for the countries that are deploying very expensive naval assets to, guided missile destroyer to face off against a motor launch, and there's a mismatch there. I mean, it does seem that this is a more cost-effective way from the side of governments and the shipping companies to deal with this as an issue.
Well, let me follow up on that, because the Council on Foreign Relations, I think, estimated that the real cost of piracy is about $200 million a year, which of course sounds like a great deal of money, and is. But when you consider the cost, the overall cost of international shipping, it's got to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. This is a fairly, small fraction of what the overall picture looks like, in which case is what you're recommending, given how many other problems there are in the world, and you can't solve all the world's problems all at once, is it really warranted?
It wouldn't be warranted as much if this remained a nuisance problem right off of the coast of Somalia. But what we've seen in the last year is a 300% rise in successful pirate attacks. We've seen pirates going much further than simply 20 or 30 nautical miles off the coast of Somalia. They're able to hit ships and targets that, frankly, have had no intent to even go past Somalia. Ships going, say, from the Persian Gulf round the Horn of Africa, not even intending to transit the Gulf of Aden, who have been struck and, in some cases, captured. So if the problem remained relatively stable, if it was a nuisance problem, if you could essentially just simply route around Somalia, I think then you could say we can afford to live with this problem. The problem, from my perspective in looking at it, is that from 2007 to 2009, the almost geometric expansion of attacks and successful attacks against bigger targets, higher profile targets, is moving this just from simply being a nuisance to where it is becoming a threat to several important sea lanes of communication. So I think that right now we can look at it and say, yes, not quite yet a major problem, but left unaddressed, it does have the potential to become something much bigger in the next several years.
I hear what you're saying, but there are shipping companies who will say, you know what, we pay the ransom, it's a cost of doing business, it's cheap, it's easy. What do you think of that approach?
Again, it's something that both shipping companies and governments will have to discuss. If shipping companies want to take this risk, and they are more or less agreed that they're happy to pay ransom, then at the same time they shouldn't be making demands of governments to send warships to patrol there. So we have a combined task force that's now deployed in the Gulf of Aden. You have ships from more than 20 countries, including Russia, India, and China. It's a pretty formidable array of naval firepower. They're at the demand of industry and business who say, governments, you should be doing something to secure the sea lanes. So governments and companies, all of us, essentially, we're going to have to start making choices. If we think it's just really a nuisance problem, less than 1% chance that a ship will be successfully seized transiting the area, and we want to accept that, then it's time to bring back the naval forces. But we can't have a company saying, we're prepared to pay ransom, but we're not really going to get involved, but we really would like governments to take up the burden and the expense of doing this. If I may add, there's another issue that's tied to this, which is that shipping companies have a tendency to want to reflag their vessels in jurisdictions where there's less regulation and where they don't have to pay as much taxes. So Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, for example. Yet when there's a problem with the sea lanes, it's the developed nations that are somehow expected to foot the bill for sending naval forces to keep the sea lanes open. I don't think that's a tenable long-term solution either.
Sure. Let me ask you about Somalia, because you and many others have argued that as long as Somalia continues to be a failed state, this is never going to get solved. Can you just connect the dots for us there and for our audience? Why is that really at the base of it all, the issue here?
Well, the issue of Somalia as a failed state is that it's a failed state at the center. It's not a failed state when you start to go to local areas where there are in fact local governments that function. The problem is that as long as we insist that on the map there is this jurisdiction called Somalia that is not able to control its borders, is not able to control pirate attacks coming from it, yet at the same time we don't want to recognize that there are pieces of Somalia that have become viable entities, and we don't want to deal with them because we say, well, Somalia, territorial integrity of Somalia has to be preserved. We sort of back ourselves into a no-win solution, into a corner where we insist that Somalia somehow has to put itself together as a state, which it has not been able to do since 1991, and then we complain that Somalians are not doing enough to control their own territory and prevent these attacks from happening. So again, as with the shipping companies, governments are going to have to make a decision soon, which is, do we want to insist that there is this entity called Somalia that we think a central government can be created for it? And you look at the number of failed transitional governments, temporary governments, provisional governments for the entire country that we've gone through since 1991. It's not exactly an optimistic track record. On the other hand, up to this point, we've been very reluctant to deal with some of the regional entities that have emerged in Somalia. And from their perspective, particularly from Puntland's perspective, is why should Puntland go out, take a major effort to crack down on piracy on behalf of an international community that doesn't want to recognize its existence? So that's another one of these dilemmas we'll have to solve.
So Somalia, what, might work better as 3 countries rather than 1? Is that what you're saying?
Potentially it might, or we might have to look at a more decentralized system. But what you've seen up to this point is the insistence, particularly from Washington, but also from a number of European capitals, that we have to put together a strong, central functioning government in Somalia in order to have a solution. And we've been doing it now for upwards on 2 decades without many results because, in a sense, we're trying to impose a government on Somalis that may not want that government in place. And as a result, we don't get the central government that we want, and therefore we don't get governments or responsible authorities in the area of Somalia that will take the measures that we would hope that they would to prevent these acts of piracy from occurring.
Nicholas, let me ask you one last thing, and that is, we know the American history in Somalia. It was a pretty bad experience the last time your soldiers went in there. Having said that, do you think the United States needs to re-explore the option of going onto Somali soil and dealing with these pirates by force where they live?
That has to be part of the issue. I think one of the reasons why I and others have put forward the Sons of Iraq model for Somalia is we also recognize that you can propose that the U.S. should go onshore, but politically it's not feasible in the current climate in the United States, not with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And to somehow suggest that a third front should be opened where large numbers of U.S. ground forces will be going ashore, it's politically a non-starter. So there does need to be an onshore solution. I think the U.S. can play more of a proactive role there, but it's not going to be the deployment of a large U.S. or multinational force at this point. And that really only leaves us with 2 options, which is we either say piracy is a nuisance, we can live with it, or we try to find and work with Somalis on the ground that will take more of an effort to crack down on it, because this third option of a massive international response going into Somalia. Looks great on paper. Plenty of op-eds have been written urging it. Politically, it's a non-starter in almost any country in the world that you go to.
Understood. Nicholas, good of you to join us on TVO again tonight. Thanks so much.
No, thank you.